Okay, so here's my video since I was not at class. I did mine on Intel's first 64-bit microprocessor called Itanium, or the Itanium TM microprocessor, as you'll discover later. I had actually worked on that microprocessor for over 6 years at Intel Corporation. There were many firsts in it. It's one of my favorite projects that I've been on, the longest project that I've been on. And also the project itself set many new standards. It was also shrouded in secrecy due to IP confidentiality. So I thought it would be a perfect topic for this paper. Okay, so I also tried to focus the paper on the 4 questions in the instructions, which were: what medium was it initially created? How was the creator, in this case Intel, protected by the intellectual property? What other entities did the creator collaborate with? In this case, it was mostly software operating system companies. And how did each of these collaborators protect their own intellectual property? So I'm going to try and shorten up the length of this video so I don't drag you through too much time, but Intel, in this case, went way overboard or over the top in how much secrecy and what the lengths they went to protect this particular piece of intellectual property. One of the reasons was it was the first 64-bit microprocessor. You all know Moore's Law, and if you looked at the trend through the 90s, 80s to 90s, Intel was booming in the race for microprocessor generation. However, we were at 32 bits back then, and at the very beginning of the project, it kicked off somewhere around 1994, roughly. It depends on where you call the kickoff. It was the projected trend that 64-bit would be an optimal architecture, especially for the server market. So they invented Itanium, and at the time, the code name for the project was called Merced. Now, in order to be on Merced, you actually had to sign a non-disclosure agreement so as not to discuss any of the details of this project, even with people inside of Intel Corporation. We were also directed not even to talk about this with our direct spouses, to give you some level of how much pressure there was on us. Of course, they put in a lot of security measures to make sure that they kept all information about Itanium totally safe. Reason being, Intel, while it is very active in the patent wars, they tend to mostly patent things that are smaller chunks of innovation and inventions. They do not generally patent entire big designs. So you could imagine if we patented a microprocessor design, that would be public knowledge, and then we would be literally giving that away to our competitors, who would then just make small modifications to work around the patent laws, and then we would have a big mess on our hands. So instead, what they did was keep everything trade secret. But of course, they used trademarks, the Itanium trademark TM name. We weren't allowed to write down the word Itanium without the word microprocessor next to it. This is very critical. So as soon as you have a trademarked name, that is a descriptor for a noun, not a noun itself. In this case, if you start calling it an Itanium, now you can actually jeopardize losing the trademark on the product. So they protected that. They had many forms of IP protection. Of course, there's a lot of intellectual property that goes into a major microprocessor design. So things that were protected specifically, aside from the trademarks and the copyrights, the silicon process technology that it was designed on was absolutely top secret. As a matter of fact, all of Intel's process technology is top secret. Intel is really it's thought of as a microprocessor company. It's really a process technology company. Today, they are a full 2 years ahead of the competition, one full technology generation ahead in terms of the performance of their silicon. Now, that doesn't come without some cost. It is more difficult to design on that technology. And to give you some scope for it, while most design teams at the time had maybe 50, maybe peaking out at roughly 100 people on a big design, that would be on something like a Pentium or Pentium 2 microprocessor. For Itanium, we had a peak head count of 550 people that lasted over 6 years of design work. So you can imagine, that's just for the people. You can imagine how big this investment was and how hard they wanted to protect that. So they protect their silicon process technology, largely with trade secrets. They protect the circuit design. So this was a very high-speed chip trying to reach performance records. So the actual circuit design techniques, some of them would be patented. So we had many patents in design techniques, but just because you patent a design technique, that doesn't expose the actual architecture of the chip. Which brings me to the architecture and microarchitecture. So the architectural specification is given to the users so they know how to program it. That is public domain, so it is just copyrighted material. The microarchitectural specification is what happens at the bit register level. It's really very deep into it, so that has a lot higher degree of protection in it. So the microarchitectural secrets were not released, only the higher level architecture. Now, we would work with other companies in developing operating systems where they did, and compilers. Actually, Intel wrote the first compiler because they were having trouble getting the performance out of it, and since we knew the microarchitecture better than anybody else, we actually pulled massive magic with compiler work. Let's see, architecture, microarchitecture. Oh, then there's the physical design. This is called mask artwork. And mask artwork is protected by something called mask artwork rights. It's actually similar to a copyright, but there's formal laws for the mask artwork, which is the layout or interconnect. It's the polygons or drawing of the design itself. And way back in the 486 days, they actually hung up one of the plots of a 486 in the Museum of Natural History, I believe, in New York City, as a piece of artwork. Now, it was at a level of detail that you couldn't get to the secret sauce out of it. Okay, so we talked about lots of the different pieces. Now, how did we go about doing that? So I talked about the non-disclosure agreement. So they also protected that by physically isolating the design engineers from the rest of the company. So we worked in an area, they sectioned off chunks of the building, and everybody on Itanium had red badges along with their normal security badge, and you needed a red badge to be able to swipe the security locks that entered that. They also had documentation that was protected in 3 levels. We had confidential documents, secret documents, and top secret documents. In order to get a secret or top secret document, you have to sign your life away in blood. Those documents are heavily protected. They are for your eyes only. Nobody else, even if you're sitting next to a coworker who has access to that same data and you're working with them, they cannot look at your book and you can't look at their book. These are not exchangeable even though the information is the same. You are responsible for your piece of anything that you sign out that's registered. So you need a reason to have the document. And if you are approved for it, you get registered that document. There are spot checks on the document to make sure you still have it in your possession. And if it is ever found in an open environment or not locked up by an Intel-approved locking system, then you lose your job. So they are pretty serious about protecting their intellectual property. I think I talked about the medium in which it was created is pretty obvious. The medium would be, in this case, the silicon process technology is the medium of which the Itanium was created, if you want to talk about that. Okay, so a little bit more about what Merced is and why it was so important. So at the time, it was a landmark achievement, and we had world records across the board. I already said it was over 500 design engineers. It might have peaked out almost at 600 at one point. There were 3 physical design sites in 3 different states, 6 years, and 3 full process technology generations, because about 1 every 2 years we crossed. So, you know, the final product design was actually on a technology that hadn't even been invented yet when we started the design. That was working about 3 technology generations, so it was working to about 4 times faster in terms of speed. The design started actually during the early 90s, early to mid-90s, didn't complete until 2001 when we launched. So, it was the first microprocessor that had over 1 billion transistors integrated on a single piece of silicon that is called the die. It was over 1 inch square, which was also the largest single piece of silicon Intel ever productized. It actually pushed the absolute limits of the reticle technology that does the imaging. So we actually used every square inch of that reticle space possible. So on top of that, the transistor sizes, by the time we got there, it was the first process technology where they were smaller than the wavelengths of light themselves, which means you can't even see them without with an optical, the most powerful optical microscope cannot image the devices that you are trying to manufacture. So anything you wanted to see had to be done with a costly scanning electron beam microscope, and then you could get some data that way. So let's see, is there anything else? So that's about it. So there was a lot of firsts. It probably was the most expensive processor, or was, that Intel had ever produced. What does that mean? It also means we knew there was going to be poor ROI on this product. It was not meant to have a high ROI by itself. It was a strategically launched project that was paving the way for things to come. And the things to come were the Xeon processors that were cheaper, better, faster once the Itanium paved the way into the market. Also, these chips were selling, I believe, if I recall correctly, for about $25,000 just for the hunk of silicon, going into $40,000 to $50,000 server boxes at the time. So it was truly something extraordinary. So, okay, now I put in my paper a clear example of intellectual property protection can be seen in the writing of this paper. Every time I wrote down Itanium, I wrote down Itanium TM trademark symbol followed by microprocessor, with a few exceptions where I used microprocessor or processor in a different way, but always having Itanium describe another noun, which is the processor itself. This was drilled and beaten into my head so strongly, even though I don't work there anymore, I just can't see myself doing it. Okay, so what else? Okay, so I talked about patents. We have an army of high-priced patent attorneys. There is a gigantic push in the company to patent everything possible, or at least put it into their patent process. So their patent process, you would give your idea, you would write it up, and it would go in front of a patent committee. I was on several of the patent committees, and they would be evaluated. The evaluation is, should we publish this as a paper, should we patent it, or discard the idea totally? So if you were lucky, you would get approval to actually patent it. But there were many cases where we would intentionally not patent something that is patentable, to make sure that our competitors didn't know about it. The other option is if it's an idea that we didn't think was worth patenting and it wasn't a trade secret, then we would publish a paper on it. This way there's prior artwork or prior paper on the idea to make it unpatentable for somebody else. This was a pretty rigorous process. Patents, by the way, even with Intel's army of patent lawyers, could take years. Some people had to wait 15 years for their patents to actually go through and get approved in the patent system. It's truly amazing. Many years is the standard. So typically I would say about 5 years from the time you submit it to when you receive it. If you get one within 5 years of that, you're pretty lucky. So just wanted to share with you how intense it is and costly to get patents. And the reason they do that is patent portfolio wars. If we get into a lawsuit with AMD, for instance, they kind of compare relative patents in the case and who has more of them, and they kind of trade weights of their patent portfolios as they're arguing about who violated whose patent rights. So that's basically what's going on with patent protection. Let's see. Okay, next we have, okay, so then we've talked about non-disclosure agreements, and the course has well covered it. Now, Intel had 3 levels of non-disclosure agreements. They had a standard NDA, they had a confidential NDA, and then they had a restricted use NDA called a RUNDA. So the restricted use NDA was the most serious and intensive of restrictions in terms of that data collection. The documents are extremely long, very detailed. You sign in blood, and if you violate anything in a RUNDA, you're in big trouble. This is if we ever had to work with a partner, and there were many. Most of the big-time partners we worked with were on terms of software development for the operating system, early testing of code, because obviously a processor is no good without the support system of the code that runs on it. And the Itanium processor actually had to support multiple operating system environments in Linux, and well, actually it wasn't Linux at the time. I'll get to that a little later in the paper. So the NDA is kind of the same NDA you know of. Then there's the confidential NDA, which had more restrictions in terms of anybody viewing that data, what they could do with them. And then, of course, the restricted use that gives you very limited ability to what you can do even if you're exposed to the data. And again, I'll reiterate that everybody on the design team had to sign an NDA just to work on it. So a company can force you, even if you are employed by them, to sign an NDA even though you are inside the company. Okay, so next. Okay, I made a list. I won't go through it because this is getting kind of long, but I'll kind of gloss through the big subtitles. So I made a list of each type of IP and how it's protected. So I had the silicon process technology, and for instance, that would be covered by trade secret, RUNDA, patents, mask work rights, and copyrights. And then I had circuit design, that would be covered by trade secret, RUNDA, patent, copyright. The other categories are the mask artwork itself, and that one is also protected by mask artwork rights, or mask work rights it's called if you want to look it up. And they will talk about mask work rights, which is a special section of the law dealing with just artwork, dealing with any silicon process technology. The architectural specification itself was protected with trademarks, patents, and copyrights. And then the micro-architectural specification, that was also protected by trade secrets, RUNDAs, patents, and copyrights. So you can see that Intel did go through quite a bit of pains in order to protect its IP. let's see, next section. Okay, why? So why did Intel go through this? So why did they go to this length? And it's pretty obvious to answer this question. Intel went through that, went to this level of scrutiny to protect their intellectual property, because their intellectual property protects the company. So the intellectual property itself has to be protected, because if you don't protect it, it can't protect you. It is the shield of defense against competitors trying to get advantages over you, steal your designs, or leverage the work that you've done. All of this, so even if they can just leverage work you've done, gives them a competitive advantage for work that they didn't have to pay for. So that's the reason they're protected so strongly. Now, I went on to say that my belief is good IP protection starts with rigorous employee training. So I've already talked about that. But it can't be stressed enough that if any company, you or your own company, if you want to protect your IP, you better train your employees on how to protect that IP. And if you haven't figured it out by now, I've had a lot of IP protection training. And it was beaten into me over the 20 years that I've spent there since day one. Especially brands, how you use the Intel registered restricted trademark. You can't just write down the word Intel or the logo. And remember back in the 90s when it had the dropped lowercase e? Short story, that dropped E in the original Intel logo was actually the drop on a mechanical typewriter. When a secretary, that's what they called them back then, actually was typing up a document, Intel, it dropped the E, and somebody liked it. That's how that trademark got originally established. But there are many, we got frustrated because it got to such a point. Intel loves to give away free t-shirts, just like UAT. But we couldn't even create a t-shirt that had the Intel logo on it without going through some massively elaborate process. So one day, there was a massive corporate policy where no more t-shirts with the Intel logo, unless they came from an approved marketing department, which pretty much ended a lot of the fun little t-shirts that we had. So, again, this is another great example of how Intel is protecting their intellectual property. Okay, so now a little bit about ROI. I've already told you it wasn't, it was known up front that we weren't going after high ROI. Obviously, we wanted to get as much ROI out of Merced or Itanium as possible. That was another thing I didn't talk specifically about in the paper, but Intel, just prior to Itanium, around the time of the Pentium and during the Pentium transition, we switched from names like the P54C. Okay, the P54C would be a Pentium process 54 generation. C stands for compaction. So if the press knew we were working on something called the P54C, they could figure out exactly what it was that we were doing. So around that time, right about when Merced got created, they went to code names that had nothing to do with the actual the actual processor itself. And then all of the code names are like lakes or valleys or features. And in terms of even picking the code names, they went through a rigorous legal process to find things that we could use that nobody else could come after us saying we're infringing on them. So we picked public domain things like national parks and streams and lakes and geographic features. So every code name after that had to be a geographic feature. And Merced, I think, is a valley somewhere out in California or an area somewhere. And that was the name of the project until it got productized when it became Itanium. Okay, so ROI, back again, we knew we would have poor ROI on this, and We were just trying to get the product out there. Of course, we wanted to have the best ROI we could. What does that mean? Well, that means you do the best possible job in the shortest possible time. Any other, if it wasn't the first 64-bit microprocessor and a project dragged on through 3 process technology generations, and it wasn't planned to do that, that's just how long it took. It was actually planned to be done in about 2 to 3 years, and it took over 6. So it was pretty amazing. We learned a lot of things back then, is that when you add resources to a project, the time does not scale proportionally. As a matter of fact, you hit these limits. When you get design teams of over about 100 people, the efficiency drops dramatically, and when the complexity of the design goes up and the efficiency goes down, you get a very poor ROI trade-off. So this really burned Intel bad. So we spent tons of money and ended up with a processor in the market that had a negative ROI and was not actually as good performance or power performance as we had hoped. However, it was the first of its kind that did pave the way for a wildly successful bout of Intel into the server market. So it did its job. It did it not quite as well because, we protected the IP, but there was nothing we could really do about the ROI. It took too long. Too many resources, too much time. Those two things together give you a bad ROI. The other thing, though, is targeting a market window. The one advantage we had is, even though we were late to market, nobody beat us to market. So that swung things in a better favor. So it gave our competitors opportunity to catch up. However, we still beat them to market, and it gave, whoever lands first, the structure gets built around them. And luckily, Intel knew that, and we did that. Now, AMD had its own 64-bit chips, but they weren't. They were working it for the desktop market at that time. Okay, so enough about that. So, positive ROI. Okay, how did they? Okay, now, what was the reason other companies would want to partner with Intel on this mega project with poor ROI? And the answer is pretty easy. Just because Intel has a poor ROI on Itanium microprocessor, TM, Itanium TM, doesn't mean that other companies would have a poor ROI as well. So one thing that is very interesting is it's hard to be a hardware company. You have to invest. They invested roughly $3.5 billion for a single fab plant to manufacture chips like Merced. $3.5 billion in the factory itself, not counting the R&D costs that go into creating the technology for that factory, as well as 550 design engineers for 6 years. And each design engineer would typically cost Intel about $300,000 to support per year. So if you take 300,000 times 500, you can start looking at how expensive just the headcount was alone. So we formed partnerships with Hewlett-Packard, GNU Linux, Microsoft, and Debian in the server domain. All of these companies and many more, we approached everybody saying, hey, look guys, we're doing this 64-bit microprocessor. You want to write an operating system for it? And those were a bunch that we did use and were successful. So we made partners. Obviously, we had to give them the microarchitectural specifications we were trying to protect, so we used RUNDAs, restricted use NDAs, whenever we shared that data to ensure that any company that had access to it could not leak any of that information out under penalty of law. So that was basically how we partnered. There wasn't much partnership going on in terms of hardware development because that was Intel's core strength. Okay, so the software companies like HP, Oracle was another one, Microsoft, they had very little to lose in terms of capital expenses compared to the hardware companies like Intel. It costs, like I said, it costs about 3.5. Now it's about $4 billion for the factories. They don't have that cost. They're writing software. So all they had to do is supply the design engineers to write the actual software, but they have virtually no hardware costs at all. And it was actually a fairly small risk for them to partner with us. So if you look at the term ROI, our partners don't care how much money we make. They only care how much money they make. So they see Intel Corporation, who was at that time by far the king of the hill in a booming market, just booming microprocessor market. Remember, back in the 90s, a typical desktop system cost an average of $3,000. Okay, so everybody was pouring into this bandwagon. It's when the internet was getting built and becoming a household item. Servers, the demand for servers was going up and up and up. And if you look at the market projections, if you're a company like HP or Oracle or Microsoft, you know you got to get into the server market space if you want to sell more products. So that's why those companies look to Intel going, hey, I got a great positive ROI. I don't have to spend much capital investment. I build an operating system and ride on Intel's success. And that's exactly what happened. Let's see. What else? So, let's see, Intel NDAs. Okay, so I think I've covered it. Let me just review my questions. So I talked about the medium. I talked a lot about how Intel was protected by their intellectual property. What other entities did the creator Intel collaborate with to maximize their ROI? Talked a lot about that. And then how did each of these collaborators protect their own intellectual property? So it goes without saying that when you're entering a partnership and you have a runda, that the other side, those companies, Intel would have to sign the agreement that we don't leak out any information about their operating systems under development to any other companies or organizations that aren't specified. So it's pretty much cut and dry. Everybody protected everybody else. All the partners worked really well together. And in the end, we had a product that broke almost every world record in its class and actually set the stage for the new millennium of the server market and internet computing being a household name. That's it. Sorry for the length of this video. It was over 32 minutes. So, bye.